There'll be no laughing.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody to the briefing meeting, July 30th. Time now, 2:51. First on the agenda, the legislative overview. Mr. Bob Sariano.
For you in your packet is a discussion draft for the legislative platform for 2014. This discussion draft comes to you after input from individual board members, from members of the superintendent's cabinet, from the superintendent herself, and also from a discussion board that the leadership created for the principals to provide some input. And your legislative liaison for the board, Mr. Scott, and the superintendent and I had a conference call to discuss all of that input and to draft this for you. This platform is designed to be your platform, not my platform, but once you adopt it at your next meeting or one of your following meetings, this will become a key roadmap for every activity that I take on your behalf. So it is important in that stretch. I present it to you in the package in the form of almost bill language where we underlined what is new. We struck out what we're recommending would be deleted from your platform from last year. And with that overview, I'll just delve into the first of the issues. We reordered the issues from last year, and I did not show that, but we've taken the state accountability system issue and we've moved that to the top because of all of the critical concerns that have happened not only this year in the school grading system, but also last year. And we added a pretty substantial statement at the beginning of the package that talks about the fact that we know that the raw scores have improved, and yet the school grades have gone down for 2 years in a row. And in particular, the writing scores, we know that the writing scores this last year improved significantly, and yet it's the writing scores that were driving down the school grades so dramatically. So we've made a strong statement about that and the fact that the credibility of the accountability system is important for everything we do and everything that the state is supposed to be doing with education, and we need to treat that with tremendous respect. And so under that we have some recommendations. As far as changes, we noted the issue with the writing score, and you'll see that in the second bullet, requesting that they reinstate the 3.5 as a passing score, which used to be the standard until the state went to 1 scorer for the purposes of saving money. Now that we're back to 2 scores for writing, there's no reason for the passing test the passing score not to be 3.5. We've deleted the 12-month notice issue, and we've added a bullet that was recommended by the principals about all state exams being aligned to the standards that are required at the time, because there is a lag as we transition into Common Core where the test is still not going to be the Common Core based test, and that is concerning for our leadership. We noted the fact that the ESE issue was heavily addressed both in legislation that passed last year and also the rule that the state board recently adopted, and so we've deleted that issue, but we've added a bullet about allowing districts and schools additional flexibility in fitting into the state testing schedule. Are there any questions or comments or concerns about the state accountability?
This last one that you just talked about, where it says allow schools, districts and schools additional flexibility. Is there a reason why we put schools in there? Can you kind of walk me through that a little bit? That kind of concerned me, because if we begin to give schools that flexibility, could we have testing all over the place?
The issue was recommended by a board member, but the way that I understood it was we might have some schools that have a special event or something along those lines, or the ability to fit more instruction in advance. If this is something that the overall board is not in consensus with, we could also drop the issue.
Well, I guess I would defer to the superintendent, and I would ask the superintendent how she feels about this, because I think that there would definitely have to be some type of language or something around this put out by the district to make sure that it's just not making, I think there'd have to be some guidelines, instead of just saying you've got the flexibility, to in having the testing within the state required testing schedule.
The way I interpreted this was that we would still, as a district, have something uniform, but there would be flexibility as a district. We wouldn't have to do it when the rest of the state. There would be flexibility within the windows of opportunity that are there, that if a school, because different schools have different issues with their schedule, and especially those tests that are required with technology, it's a challenge depending on what you've got in your building and what you've got on campus. So I interpreted this, and Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, that it wouldn't be we have an option as a district and then schools could do whatever they want. We would still drive it as a district, but we would take into consideration the unique needs of our different schools. Does that make sense? So the district would still have a uniform, this is our testing window, but it would take into consideration what our schools actually need versus the state giving us a window and we have to live with it regardless of the specific needs of our district. So it's not the schools deciding when they're going to test, it's the district deciding based on the needs of our schools. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, but that's not the way it reads. It
Okay,
reads to give the school the flexibility. So not only do you give the districts the flexibility, but you give the schools as well. So what you're saying is there would be some type of protocol for the schools to follow. So making sure that we have some type of protocol gives me some ease, because I don't want to just see this to where the schools can make the decisions, because I can see it all over the place.
No, that won't happen.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Are there any other questions about this section? And your drafting committee, after having the benefit of this workshop and this briefing, is likely to meet again and make adjustments as appropriate to clarify and improve the consensus of the board. The next issue was capital outlay needs. We moved this one up out of the order that it was in previously as well, because of the capital is the kind of thing that if you don't monitor it 5 years out, it works its way into a crisis for you, especially in a district like Lee that was growing quickly before and is likely to grow again in the future. I mean, we are growing again, but potentially we could be growing very rapidly again in the future. So we brought this issue up higher, and we added a bullet about allowing districts to recover state capital outlay funds received by a charter school if it closes or is repurposed.
And that should have two added in there, allow districts to. That's been left out. I'm sure that's just a word, that's just a typo.
Are there any other comments about that section? The third bullet is deals with public school operations funding, and the discussion draft leaves the quote from the Constitution about education being the paramount duty. We left the bullet about developing a long-term plan to fund a world-class system in Florida. even with the increases that we've seen in the last couple of years, we're still not to the level of funding that we received in total in 2007. And the per-student funding, especially when you back out class size reduction funding, which is mandated by the Constitution, the base student allocation takes us back more in the neighborhood of 2005 or 2006. So there's certainly room to improve in that area. We added a bullet because about 2 weeks ago there was a major press release from the Florida Chambers of Commerce and some of the other large business interests where they have endorsed together the state finding a way to collect sales tax on internet-based sales, which in fact the law says citizens are going to pay, are required to pay that tax if the vendor that they use does not collect it for them. However, we know that that doesn't happen very often. And just like was done with mail order sales back in the mid last century, we found a way to collect on those sales from the Sears catalog, a long time ago. It's time to find a way to collect that revenue on that sales tax. The estimates on that are that it could be $1.5 billion for Florida in the first year. So this is a substantial, significant concern. Are there any questions or concerns about that? The next bullet remains intact for the way it read exactly last year about respecting local constitutional authority for school boards. There's the quote from the Constitution on the role and the authority of school boards, and we relate that directly back to some of the laws as they relate to charter schools where either the state board or the commissioner or others are given authority over charter schools that the Constitution says are public schools in your jurisdiction. Are there any questions about that issue?
Ms. Dozier?
And down here where it says local school board decisions to grant or reject, would that be better worded if we put grant local school boards authority to grant or reject after I had read that last year, that came up to my mind and I forgot to read that this time. And I just think it flows better to put grant local school boards authority to grant or reject, and I know we shouldn't use the same word twice in a sentence, we should think of something else. Allow local school boards, that would be, allow local school boards authority to grant or reject a charter school application.
Very good. Are there any other comments on that section?
Oh, please continue.
We continued the paragraph about unfunded mandates. Certainly the legislature was much better about either funding their mandates last year or not passing them. And there were a number of bills that were filed that were opposed by the School Boards Association statewide and other education-related groups on this point, and many of those bills fell by the wayside. One of the bills that did not was Senate Bill 1108, which the legislature felt was very important, dealing with ESE students and trying to increase the prevalence of inclusion being the norm for instruction for ESE students. And that's good and well-meaning, but the legislature can't simply mandate that policy and expect to have more at the same time that the ESE guaranteed allocation was essentially left flat. And we know that within the increase that we received that there was $1 billion increase for public education, and about $300 million of it was offset the additional cost for retirement system. Well, those costs also occurred within ESE services, and yet all that money was left in the general part. So really, the legislature needs to look at that issue, and when they have a mandate that they feel the policy is important, then they also need to make sure that the money follows it. And so in this case, we noted really one of the few mandates that was passed new last year that was unfunded dealt with this ESE instruction, and that's unfortunate. But so we noted that particular issue. We deleted the concern about the mandates for technology needed for the end of course testing, because there was a solution for that previous mandate that was included in Senate Bill 1076, where the requirements to shift to online testing won't occur until the state has completed a study to prove that all the schools are ready to handle that. And the others we left. Are there any questions about that section?
Continue.
In the discussion draft, we have deleted the previous language as it related to class size reduction penalties. We did not get 100% of what we asked for in that we asked for the penalties to be eliminated. But at least in the case of Lee County schools, the bill that did pass included language in House Bill 7009 that said in schools of choice, the penalties would be calculated for public schools of choice the same way that they are for charter schools. And so with that being the solution, and it having been heavily debated over the course of the session, in the discussion draft, we felt that that was probably resolved, and we had received most of what we asked for, and it was time for that issue to go away. If there aren't any questions about that, then the next bullet has been in our platform ever since the year that we first started seeing the budgets decline. And we knew in 2007 and 2008 and 2009 that the state was facing a recession, and that the state budget was going the wrong way, and that the vast majority of money, if there ever was even a little bit of extra money, was likely to go to class size reduction. But even in the midst of that, we wanted to be proactive and identify the kind of issues where, when the budget turned around, that these are the kinds of areas that we would hope that the legislature would put extra money if they felt the need to earmark it. And if they don't feel the need to earmark it, then these are the kinds of things that you're saying would be your priorities for where you would want to put the money if you had it in the general fund. And so we've identified enhanced student services, longer school days, longer school years, and improved teacher quality and high quality pre-K programs. The only change is that we've moved the student services from being the last item on the list to being one of the first items on the list. Clearly, as we've implemented class size reduction over the course of the last 11 or 12 years, student services have taken a huge hit in that implementation. And when the budgets start to turn around, there will be an opportunity to enhance that again. And that's the discussion. Are there any questions about that item?
Please continue.
We left the items as it related to charter school equity exactly as they were. We talk about recovering the charter school administrative fee, where at this point the latest analysis that I've seen by the DOE, Lee County spends twice as much on serving charter schools as what we receive from the administrative fee. And the second bullet, we talk about increasing the regulatory equity between charter schools and traditional public schools from the state viewpoint, and we would like to see that accomplished by not by more regulations on charter schools, but by less regulation on public schools, that they should match, but that's the way we would like them to go. And if there's no questions about that section, the last three items that were part of the platform were all new issues to the platform. The first one reflects a board resolution that passed in the middle of session, where the board asked the legislature if they could be granted the authority to put a referendum before the voters, which would allow the board to expand its membership by 2. And the resolution said that the how the apportionment would occur would be decided by the school board and included in the referendum, and that's what you passed as your resolution. So I'm working on that as something you've already adopted, unless you change your mind. The second item related to dual enrollment, and we know that this is one of the few items that passed last year, the requirement to pay community colleges the student tuition cost if the student was attending the college on the college campus, has been one of the losses from last year. That statewide was somewhere in excess of $60 million of the $1 billion that was for public education was really for community colleges. Certainly the legislature has all the authority it needs to fund the community colleges, and they don't need to do it through the FEFP. Finally, there was a bill that was considered last year. It did not pass the legislature, but it was a committee bill of a select committee of the House that dealt with sovereign immunity issues. And the bill went through several different incarnations, but in one of them, the sovereign immunity caps could have been raised as high as $5 million from where they are now, $200,000 and $300,000 per person and per occurrence. So that seemed a little excessive. Our business services folks and our risk manager had sent information up suggesting that we have no idea how the reinsurance market would react to that for local governments, since we haven't seen anything like that and have no experience to guide us. And so we have a position statement to reject attempts to dramatically increase sovereign immunity caps for local governments, and to make sure that all sovereign immunity caps are uniform between local governments and state agencies, because another facet of that bill was that the state exempted its own agencies from the increased cap. It was a good idea for local governments, but it wasn't so good for the state. So those are the items that we have pulled together for discussion purposes. If there's any other input from the board members or the staff or the public on what you want from that, we'll take that back to your drafting committee and give you a good document to adopt in a few weeks.
Board members, any questions, comments? Ms. Dozier.
No question, just a few comments. I would like to thank Mr. Scott for his efforts during the past year to serve as the legislative representative to go to Tallahassee on behalf of this board and on behalf of this school district. And, of course, always a sentiment of gratitude goes out to the Sarahs, because even though we are under contract with the Sarah brothers, we have the entire Sarah entourage at our disposal anytime we have needs in certain areas. and it's a relationship that we have had with this, between the district and between this family for a long time, and it's served us very well. So thank you very much for everything that you do for the school district and on behalf of our children. And I will say that anytime the Sarah boys, and I call them both my boys, anytime they talk about Lee County, it's never the school district, but it's our school district. You know, they consider themselves a part of our district family as well, and I just appreciate their lobbying efforts on behalf of all the children that we serve. So thank you, and thank you, Mr. Scott, and hopefully we'll have a great session this year and get all of our, they'll just say, oh, let's pass this entire platform.
Anybody else? Mr. Scott.
Well, I want to thank Bob as well for his work on this and for everybody in the district who made contributions. Trying to zero it in and put it in as simple a terms but as direct terms as possible is critically important, because having been up there a couple of years, the voices are all over the place and it gets rather chaotic at certain points in time. So if your message isn't clear, crisp, and short, it sometimes can get lost. So our next stop is going to be up in Sarasota in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, with the consortium. And note the items on our list are going to be a part of that discussion, and at that stage we determine whether or not it'll be something that moves to the state level and gets included, or whether it stays simply on our list. It'll always be on our list, but whether it gets added to that state list. So I'm looking forward, and I understand several of us are planning on going up there for that meeting. So hopefully our voices will be loud and somewhat influential while we're up there. But thank you, Bob, for your hard work on this.
Thank you. Anybody else? Thank you so much, as always.
I'll just say that we're going to start our conversations tomorrow with our legislative delegation. Bob and Dr. Graham and I are going to start visiting with, I guess it's Representative Rodriguez, Fitzenhagen, and Senator Richter tomorrow, beginning to talk about these things and plant the seeds early on. So,
Thank you for all your work. Next, Mr. Martin.
Yes, Mr. Armstrong, board members, I need to have a discussion with you today concerning Policy 1.09 board meetings, and specifically the component that addresses public comment. For a number of years, the Attorney General has advised public bodies such as school boards that public comment is required to be provided, that opportunity at meetings. But over the last couple of years, we've received decisions from 2 District Court of Appeals saying that the statute, that no Florida statute nor the Constitution requires the provision of public comment at such meetings. The legislature addressed that confusion in its last session, passing a bill that specifically requires that any time that a proposition is before a public body, such as a school board, that an opportunity for public comment be provided. In the course of establishing that clear right, the legislature also provided some guidelines with respect to the procedures for that public comment to be received. And those are the issues that I need to talk to you about today to get some guidance on how you want to address those in your board meeting policy concerning public comment. The document that you have, yes, Ms. Dozier?
Before we do that, it's not something that you have actually recommended, but as long as we are dealing with this policy, the very first item 1A, where it says 11 p.m. and then it says may,
Yes.
I would like to see that say will, because any work done after 11 p.m., if we've been here since 6 o'clock, cannot be good work, and we would not be at our best in making decisions. And I just think that that should say will. That would mean that we have to stop after then.
Agreement from the board on that issue?
Colleagues?
So you're saying that we will stop at 11 p.m.
Basically, yes, that's what it says. It says which continues past 11 p.m., will be continued. In other words, if we go to 11 and then we see it's 11:01, we would continue it to a time certain.
I'm in.
I concur.
All right, we'll include that revision when the policy comes before the school board. The draft that you have today is just that. It's just time for an introductory discussion. This matter has not, this policy revision has not been advertised at this point. Fortunately, the legislature gave us a little bit of time on this one. The law is not effective till the 1st of October, so we have a little bit of time to discuss and for you to provide direction on what you wish to do with the policy. Some of the issues that we need to discuss are pretty clearly dictated by the new statute, and some provide you discretion, so I'd like to walk through them one at a time and get your direction on those. I've provided you a new document at your table today that you should each have a copy of. It has some colors on pages 3 and 4 with some additional language after the initial draft was done for your briefing packet.
Oh, so I was still, because I had written a lot of stuff on this. This is even different than this?
No, it's just color.
Yes, ma'am. You should have one with some colors on pages 3 and 4. That is a different one, yes.
Okay, all right, thank you.
That's the one we want to work
It
with
is
today.
different. Okay.
The first subject I want to talk to you about is on page 4, paragraph B, the title being Comment on Board Member Motion. The statute is clear that any time a proposition is before that public body, there needs to be an opportunity for public comment. The Lee County School Board has been in the habit of, at times, making motions during board member comment, which would not have appeared on the agenda. So during regular public comment time, there is not an opportunity to address that proposition that is then before the school board when that motion is made. And that's why I've drafted proposed language here that you see that if such a motion is made and seconded, not in response to a recommendation from the superintendent or the attorney, that at that point there'll be an opportunity provided to comment on the subject of the motion. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Dozier.
Okay, and when I saw this, my question was, when do you see that we would have this? And I thought about it in my mind with if it happens on the evening that, like you make a motion and the motion passes, on the evening that the motion passes would be the time that you have to allow for public comment. So my question is, would you have to allow the public comment before the vote is taken or after the vote is taken? Because after you've taken the vote, would it be when there's a motion on the floor at that time there would be time for public comment? Because a lot of times that public can persuade a board member. So do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, I do. And the public comment would need to occur before the vote.
Okay,
It could
so
be
I think
before-
we would need to put that in here. We would need to have that language in here, so it would be totally clear. Because as it stands, I don't think that that's clear.
That's on the subject of the motion alone.
Well, as it reads right now, it says before discussion of the motion by the school board, which would be after a motion and a second and before discussion begins. And we could also, if it makes the board feel more comfortable, we can certainly say just before discussion and vote.
I would be more comfortable with that, with it being totally clear that there's no, I mean, to me, I would prefer that.
Ms. Morgan?
Okay, so we're changing it from the public would comment after the motion was made, but before the board discussed it, to after the motion was made and after the board discussed it.
No. The board would not discuss it until after the public comment was made. Is that correct?
That's
the
what it
way-
already says, isn't it?
Well, but it doesn't say anything about the vote taking place. And that was what, I think that we need to add something in there so it will be absolutely clear to everybody in the public that, because we have had several motions, I just think that makes it cleaner to say before the vote is taken. I mean, that may be redundant, but I just think that makes cleaner language and clearer language.
Okay.
We could just add a phrase at the end saying, "and before the vote is taken."
Yeah, that was what I was,
I prefer to see that myself in there. This way there's no gray area.
And the second issue on that matter that we,
Mr. Scott?
I'm sorry.
I'm just concerned that sometimes, because I recall motions that have come up during discussion, where there might not be anybody here who has a particular interest in that. And that by making the motion and having the discussion and going to a vote, those that might have an opinion about it wouldn't have known it was coming, consequently weren't here. I think that's a flaw in the process.
well, the only thing that I would say to that is, if they are truly interested in educational issues, they might have been here anyway, just to serve the purpose of speaking to any educational issues, because that would, if we would have to, that would prohibit us, if we wait until the next time, that would prohibit us from making a decision, and it might be something that, like there's some emergency. I mean, I can see us using this as some type of an emergency. For instance, I don't want to, I mean, I can think of one incident right now where there was a motion made, and I'm not sure that there was a advertisement of the meeting that took place, because it was an emergency situation. And if we had to say, wait until the board, acts at such and such time, it would prohibit the board from making that decision immediately. And I'm speaking of, and the situation that came to my mind, and God forgive me, I mean, I don't want to, but it was a situation that involved the superintendent, the absence of the superintendent, and that would prohibit the board from making that decision right then to put a superintendent in place. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
So that's why I think that we have to be allowed to have the authority to make the decision right then and there if you have a situation that comes up that you need to make the decision.
I'm just
right
trying
then.
to point out what could potentially down the road be a problem, that we took action, and those who had an interest in speaking to that action prior to our vote didn't have knowledge of the fact we were going to have such a conversation.
And I certainly understand that, but in an emergency situation, I would hate to see our hands tied.
Well, I wouldn't want to either, so I guess there's a separation between what's an emergency and what would not be an emergency, and how do you define that, and would this be a place where that should go?
I would suggest to not be placed in policy. That certainly is a discussion that the board then can have each time you're dealing with an individual issue, to have the discussion, is this a decision that needs to be made tonight, or is this something we can place on a future agenda so the public clearly has notice and an opportunity to comment?
And not to be redundant or not to beat a horse that's laying down, but when would you see the motion being made here? I mean, not the motion, but the second in the motion, because once you have the motion and the second, I mean, would you jump in and give advice at that point, following Robert's Rules of Order? Because, for instance, if you have a motion that comes on the table, and then the person seconds the motion, at that point, unless you have another motion to postpone the motion, it just seems like it's getting real cumbersome to me. Something that is meant to be a good thing is becoming very, very cumbersome.
Yes. Well, certainly there wouldn't be a reason to receive the public comment until there is a second. You need a motion and a second, because the board can't take action without that.
Right.
I understand what you're saying. If there is a motion and a second to take a particular action, you receive the public comment, and then later there's a motion to amend by changing that motion in some way, that would appear to create a need for a second opportunity for comment, because now it's a different proposition before the school board.
Okay, and because you have the motion, then you have the second, then you have to have the public comment.
Yes.
So when you,
Or you
I
could-
guess my question would be, when you have the motion, let's say that Ms. Morgan makes a motion, and I I want to consider the motion, but I do not want to second the motion because I don't want to go through public comment tonight. I would prefer that it be put on the next agenda because it's an item that's not emergency, and it can be put on the future agenda. So how would you deal with that situation? Because in order to speak, I'm supposed to second the motion before I can discuss it.
Yes.
So I'm not trying to create a bucket of worms here, but the bucket of worms already exist.
Well, I guess the one way you can address that is by providing the opportunity at the conclusion of discussion, when it's time to proceed to the vote, because any motion to postpone or to table would have occurred by that time. So we could adjust the language to say, after discussion of the motion by the school board and
But
before
before
the
the
vote is
vote.
taken.
I think that would clean it up considerably.
Understand your point.
Or we could just say that, and we might not always remember it because sometimes when, in the heat of a moment or, when you're thinking about something, I could say that we could all have an agreement that we would say, well, I'm thinking about bringing a motion forward tonight, and then we could have discussion with the colleagues or something. But I think the best way would be what you just said.
Okay. So we'll adjust that wording to after discussion of the motion by the school board and before the vote is taken.
And before public comment.
Well, that the opportunity for the public comment will be provided
After the discussion.
and before the vote is taken.
Okay, all right. And then, of course, that would not limit the board members to having additional comment once public comment is over.
Certainly.
Okay, thank you.
The other component of this issue that I need to discuss with you, and you'll see an adjustment in the green language on the newer handout I provided to you, and giving that language a little bit more thought and discussing it with some colleagues. There actually are some situations where that motion during the board comment time would not be the official action of the board, and therefore there wouldn't be a requirement to have public comment at that time. A good example is many times the motion that you're making at that point is to direct the superintendent or direct the attorney to draft new language for a policy and bring it back at a future time for board consideration and adoption. Well, that's not the final action. That's not the final official action to revise that policy. It would always come back to you for a vote at a public hearing. In that situation, before there's an official action, it would be on an agenda. There would be an opportunity for public comment. So in those situations, there wouldn't be a need to provide that opportunity for public comment at that point.
Mr. Sturgis, do you have a question?
Well, I do, but I'm not sure that it refers to what you were just talking about or the item that we skipped over, number 4, and that's same on page 3. It begins on page 3 and goes on to page 4, because I had written out here busing changes, busing stop changes, bell time changes. I would just write down some ideas that came to my
I
mind.
was going to get back to that issue.
Okay,
eventually, but-
so my question would be where it says organization to select one or more representatives, because the chair is the one that has control over the public comment.
Yes.
Would we want to put some language in there about, because I know I used to, when I served as chair, I would say something like, are there multiple individuals? Would all of you be willing to have one speaker that speaks on behalf of this subject? Like have some clear language that the board chair could use when you have situations such as bell times, school bus stop changes, all of those things, because these are situations when it would certainly pertain to having multiple individuals at the coming before the board on
Okay.
the same issue, speaking on the same issue.
Yes, ma'am. I wanted to be sure that
Morgan?
certainly we can proceed to that discussion on that one. I wanted to be sure that we were complete on paragraph B first before we move to that. Is there anything else we want to discuss in paragraph B on page 4?
No, sir.
Okay, then the one that you raised, Ms. Dozier, which on page 3, paragraph 4, which again is language that comes with the new statute that suggests that the board can have a rule establishing procedures allowing a representative of a group to address the board on behalf of that entire group of speakers when there are a number. So that's what this is designed to address.
Okay, yes, and that was, my question for that was, all right, I know that we have in policy where we reduce the number of minutes that people are given,
Yes.
but I'm not going to really want to give up my right to speak and let one person in my group speak if that person still only gets 2 minutes or 3 minutes. So if you've got one person that you are going to designate to have the right to speak, would we want to put something in language that would give that person additional time to speak? Let's say you have a group of 50 people that are coming out, and all 50 of those people are on the same issue, and so that would give a total of 25 minutes, correct? The way the policy now reads, correct?
I'm sorry, how many people?
Okay, you have 50, and then,
They would have 1 minute each.
okay,
Under-
so
under
that would
present
give
policy.
25 minutes.
Would be 50 minutes.
Oh, 50 minutes, okay, excuse me, all right. I did that wrong, okay. So instead of giving, you're offering them the opportunity to have one spokesperson, because a lot of people are very uncomfortable speaking, and they do it just because they are, with a group, and the group is encouraging them to speak, but I'm sure they'd love to have a policy that says that we would give the authority to one individual in the group. But is there some way we can put it in here to where we would give that individual additional time to speak, because they might have they've got additional people that are giving them ideas, and so they might need additional time to speak. That's,
Certainly, if that's the board's desire, then yes, it could provide, the language that you see drafted there would allow for the time that an individual speaker receives already under the policy, which is the 3
Right.
minutes. But
right,
the board can certainly adjust that to allow for a longer period of time based upon how many individuals that speaker is representing or something of
right.
that
And see,
nature.
I just thought of it trying to be in fairness to groups that come before us. Because, telling them, well, all of you speak, well, you allow one person to speak, but you only get 2 minutes. That's not really an incentive to only have one person to speak. But if you give them additional time, they might be more comfortable having one person represent them.
And can we change organization to group? I mean, organization to me sounds like a formal, a recognized entity of some kind, as opposed to just a group of people who share a common interest at one point in time.
I understand.
Yeah. If multiple members of a group with concerns, like concerns,
Or interest group, yeah.
I almost called you yesterday, and I knew it would have been a long conversation if I'd called you.
I've been fine. So how do we want to proceed with respect to the time of, amount of time allotted to the representative speaker?
Ms. Morgan?
I like the notion that the chair is given discretion with respect to the representation made by a member of an interest group.
The chair is given discretion to allot an appropriate period of time based upon the number
Well, in
of
other words, you
speakers.
would allow the chairman to make the time limit?
Up to a maximum?
Yeah, I would say up to a maximum of 5 or
Yeah, maximum
minutes.
of like 5 minutes. I wonder if they've cleaned these carpets recently.
The next issue, while we're on that page, is in paragraph 2, and page 3. One area of authority that the new statute provides. Well, two areas of authority are that you can have a rule addressing the amount of time an individual speaker is allowed, which you already have in your policy. But also there's a provision in the statute that says that you can designate a specific period of time for public comment as a whole. So that's what this proposed language is designed to address, that you would set a maximum time period of 1 hour, and with your present rules that reduce the time per speaker to 1 minute after you get past 30, then the maximum number of speakers would be 60 within that 1 hour. Again, this is an area of discretion. It's not a mandate by the statute, but the statute gives you authority to set that type of limitation.
Ms. Dozier.
Well, I do know that our legislative delegation, I kind of, look to them for examples. And our legislative delegation, every time they have their meeting in November, December, when they have it, they always have a time certain as well as a limit of the amount of time. And I think that's good to do that, simply because you've got business to take care of. And I know that there have been on a few situations where, and I can remember like when we the school start time changes, when we flip-flopped. I mean, we had lots of people here, and we didn't even get to, a lot of times, the order of business until 10 o'clock at night. And by that time, I think limiting it is, I think they've done it for a reason, because they see the necessity in doing it, and I think that we should have something in policy that has that.
I agree with the 60-minute limit.
I concur.
The last issue that I need to discuss with you is on page 4, the title Quasi-Judicial Hearings. The statute makes it clear that one situation in which you are not required to receive public comment is when you're providing quasi-judicial action. And this is basically in a situation where there has already been a hearing on the issue and a recommended order is coming back to you for you to take final action. And I provide a few examples there, such as bid protest, employee discipline matters, where there's already been an administrative hearing. The hearing officer or judge has provided you a recommended order. Now it's time for you to issue a final order. The statute says you don't have to allow public comment, though the parties to those proceedings, of course, would still have that opportunity to address you. Questions about that issue?
I'm okay with it.
I heard groaning, but I don't know what that was.
Curious of myself.
It was just a little indigestion, it went away.
Okay.
Right, I'll make the adjustments that have been requested, and again, this policy, or the law, is not effective till the 1st of October, so it'll come to you at a briefing meeting in September, and then a public hearing at the end of September for action. Yes?
On my other sheet, I was working from 2 sheets because I had done this at home. Sorry about that. But I thank you for the red. I like it better like this. Thank you for that. But on page 3, there was one other thing that I forgot to say. Where at the very item 2, where it says to ensure that the school board has the time necessary to consider the issues, this portion, should it be in this portion of the meeting? Or this portion of the meeting, comma, this portion of the meeting shall, okay, all right,
It's
never
referring
mind.
Yeah.
Never mind. I just written that in very quickly when I was reading it last night, or yesterday. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Next on the agenda, Ms. Patty Elkin.
Come on up, Pat. Before Patty, while she's on her way up, I just want to share with you that this policy has yet to be advertised for public hearing. So this is a discussion, so we can come up with we need some direction from you, so when we do advertise it for a public hearing, we have some feedback. So Patty's basically going to tell you how we got to this point and where the policy language came from, and then I'm going to ask you if you want my thoughts on it before you discuss or after you discuss, and I'll let you all tell me that at that time.
Second.
We always want the superintendent's recommendations first.
Good afternoon, board members, superintendent. Thank you for allowing me to come here and speak a little bit about the draft policy. You should have in your packet both a copy of the wording that came from that committee as well as the PowerPoint that was presented on June 4th. And just to refresh your memory, if you think back at the very beginning of the school year last year, the board gave a directive to the superintendent to form a committee and begin to meet with that committee and talk about drafting some policy language. We did meet as a committee. We looked at other districts. As I believe I mentioned in June, it was very challenging to find other districts with a health education policy. That is not a common finding out there. It is not a statutory requirement. We did find one in Monroe County and a few other counties. We even looked outside of Florida for health education policies and did have some challenges in finding policy language. The committee met with teachers, with district administrators, with school-based administrators, and what you see before you is the draft language that we came up with as a committee for a starting place for you to discuss. Okay.
Thanks,
Still up.
Thank you.
Dr. Graham, your opinion, please.
I've looked through this, and I think you really need to hear what Patty said, that this is highly unusual. It was difficult for the committee to find places that had such policy.
If I may add one thing, when I heard her say Monroe County actually had a policy, Monroe County actually had a nurse on their school board for many years, and that's how they got the policy. So, you know, it's not unusual that boards don't have this policy. Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
I felt like that was a piece of information that needed to be out there.
Great. I'll also tell you there are health standards in the standards that are expected to be taught in the Florida curriculum, and those are covered in a variety of ways. So I'm just going to share with you my initial response to this in talking to people who were part of the committee, and then you all, obviously it's your decision what you want to do with the policy. No issue with the first three elements, that comprehensive health education is required instruction, grades K through 12. Health education is required already. Comprehensive health education shall be taught efficiently and faithfully using the courses of study and adopted standards and employing the approved methods of instruction. We have instructional strategies in place, and we continue to work with those with our teachers as we're working on using research-based instructional strategies. We know that we are expected to follow the standards of the state, and so we work to be sure that that's happening in every subject area, including health. And comprehensive health education shall address the concepts in accordance with Florida statutes. All that I would put forth is already happening. The number 4, comprehensive health education shall be considered a separate subject apart from physical education. That is in direct conflict with the HOPE class that high schools are required to teach. It's a high school graduation requirement to take HOPE, and it is a health and PE class together. So I'm not sure how we would, what we're basically saying is, yes, they have to take HOPE because the state says so, but then we're also going to, if we kept this language, they'd also have to take another health class in addition to that, which is not required by the state. Beginning with the 2013-2014 school year, all schools will implement the district-approved, evidence-based, age-appropriate, comprehensive health education curriculum. My understanding is what was agreed to, and I would tell you the school year will have well started before we'd even be able to pass this policy. That's the first thing I'll say. But secondly, the agreement, my understanding is that every school would be expected this year to have a plan in place to address how they would teach the comprehensive health program. And that, I would suggest to you, would look different from school to school based on the requirements. And Jean Ann was part of this conversation, and I'm going to use her school as an example. Cypress Lake Center for Cypress Lake Middle, the arts magnet, all of their elected teachers except 2 teach arts classes. And so how they would get this health curriculum presented would look very different than a middle school that had a different attractor or no attractor at all. So it would look different from school to school. That's the reason to have everyone's plan, because the goal is that everyone be teaching health standards and being sure they're covered in the curriculum somehow. So 2013-14 would be everybody showing their plan. The next, beginning with the 2014-15 school year, all secondary and K-8 schools will have a certificated health education teacher on staff. Again, because every school would look different, I'm unsure that that would be necessary, because there are standards. Many of the health standards can be taught through science. And I'll go back to high school. Many of the health standards, well, they're taught in the HOPE class. So I'll go back to Cypress as an example. What elected teacher would we take away to be sure that we have a health teacher? Because that's what it would come down to. Beginning with the 2015-16 school year, all middle school students will be required to complete a minimum of 1 semester of health education. I would say if we're going to do anything as far as a requirement of health education, it would be that we complete the teaching of the standards of health education rather than putting a time frame on it. Because again, there are many ways to teach the standards without requiring a separate class or a maximum or minimum period of time to do that. And then finally, 8 and 9 there's nothing to argue about. This has gone on as long as I can remember, that it is always the parent's option in a course like this to opt out of their child being based on religious reasons, personal preference. There are still parents out there who would like the opportunity to teach some of these things on their own. So, and the policy would be reviewed annually by the curriculum department and revised as needed. So those are just in discussing, because I wasn't here for the genesis of this. I'm coming in on the tail end, and I had lots of questions, and these are my reactions as your superintendent to what's been developed thus far.
Ms. Dozier.
Yes, Dr. Graham and I had a very lengthy conversation yesterday around this policy, and when I looked at this, I immediately wrote down under number 5, 6, and 7, cost, cost, cost. It seems like we are walking down a dual path here. We are constantly asking the legislators not to give us any unfunded mandates, and yet we are putting in place an unfunded mandate that we are going to require of ourselves right here, because there is no funding for this. And as Mr. Serra said when he was here, we still have not gotten back to the level of funding that we had in 2007. So cost is something that greatly concerns me, because this is a tremendous cost factor. Entitlement is something else. You've got an entitlement. Once you give something out there, it now becomes an entitlement. It no longer is something that you can take away, because it's just automatically. In fact, I'm thinking of several years ago when we had a little extra money, we gave bonuses at some point, and the reason the bonuses were given was because we knew that raises were a reoccurring thing, whereas the bonuses are a one-time thing. So the entitlement piece. The last piece, there's still no research, and I know that you can take data and you can manipulate it, and you can have it say, I can take a piece of data, you can take a piece of data, and she can take a piece of data, and the three of us can get the data to say 3 different things if you know how to manipulate data. I'm not sure that some of the data that we were given as far as the STDs and are accurate, and I'm just going to put it out there. I'm not sure that that is accurate data that we received. I'm just not sure that that is actually correct. So the research, I'm not sure that the research that we were provided, I'm not sure how accurate it was. The way this policy is right now, and with the funding levels where they are, I could never support this.
Board members, anybody else with comments or questions? Ms. Morgan?
As I understand it, the momentum behind this came out of the data, and I'm willing to accept the data as was put forward. Lee County has a problem, has a health problem. So the question is, how do we address it? And I guess from my perspective, I think putting a policy in place without a curriculum, putting a policy in place that requires a curriculum is difficult for me. I want to know how it is that the curriculum we intend to put in place tackles specifically the problems that were raised, that were the genesis of this whole discussion. So, in reading through this and in having a conversation with Dr. Graham, I reflected on what ALC is doing, which is to say that there are significant problems with ALC. They are not addressing them in the curriculum necessarily. They are addressing them with independent programs designed to meet the needs of individual students. So I guess what I'm looking for is an understanding of how it is that this policy will help us address the concerns that we have without talking specifically to the curriculum that will be put in place. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's where I am.
Mr. Scott?
I'm going to repeat much of what you said because I believe that what we heard initially was fairly frightening in terms of what's happening with young people and their health here. And I happen to work in an area where you have a 70% illegitimacy rate. It's astonishing, terrifying. And I believe we were reacting to what we were hearing and saying we really ought to be doing something. There is some kind of a rusty framework in place that we should be utilizing in a more efficient way. But I agree with you. I don't want to go on down this path unless there's a very clear curriculum that's been identified as to how we're going to attack the problems that are real in this community. The state numbers, whether the data is right or not right, I mean, gee, I hope somebody doesn't say, let's throw all the data out. Some of it has to be somewhat true. But I'm not sure this is the right way to go about doing it, although I appreciate what the people have done in terms of the work they've put into this. There's still a lot of questions in my mind for which we don't have the answers. And I'm not sure it is our responsibility, frankly, to solve all of this ourselves. It is a community-wide, and I'm talking about a county-wide problem.
And I think this, if I'm understanding the history, and I get to say that a little longer. I wasn't here. I won't be able to say that too much longer. Yeah, Mr. Scott says I don't have much time left.
Yes.
This was an extension of Healthy Lee, and I saw Robbie here. And Healthy Lee is exactly what you said. It is it countywide? We'll say community-wide. So, but large involvement from many entities and other agencies. And I think there was an attempt on the part of this board to support that somehow and involve themselves in saying, yes, this is a community-wide issue, and yes, we do need to be involved somehow. And so then that somehow led to, let's create a health class for our children. So we have a growing wellness movement in our district for the adults, and I think in modeling that for children, I'm going to start modeling that soon. But I think for children, we will be modeling for them, and we will be able to put some things in place automatically. And again, I'm going to go back to there are very clear standards that are expected to be taught, and we need to be sure that we're doing that. There are things we can do, I think, without having a policy with this many specifics. But I think the intent in the beginning was to support Healthy Lee and be a part of that. And I think there are ways to do that.
Are you convinced we're actually doing now what we're supposed to be doing?
I'm convinced that it's easier to do at the high school level because the course is there. I am unable to tell you for sure what's happening in elementary and middle, and I can understand the concern about middle, why the emphasis would have been on middle here, because that's really when they start exploring, and, well, now they say 9 is the new 13, so it may be elementary school now. So that's something we're going to have to look at, and I know that Patty and Mrs. Coots have already begun conversation with what's really happening in the schools. So I can commit to you, we're going to be sure that the standards are being covered if they're not already, but they may already be.
I'd much prefer that we become partners with people who are already in that world.
Right.
That's what they do with their lives, and become their partners from the school point of view, and not try to usurp somebody else's role in things, to build a real partnership that will help get the voices from all different directions to the people who need to hear it.
I just need some direction from the board, whether you want us to do something with this language or you want to go a different direction.
On a personal note, I can just sit here and echo the same thing each one of my colleagues have said: cost, cost, cost. I mean, we look at this, there's no, what's this going to cost? It's going to be a recurring cost over, and we've had a lengthy conversation about this, Dr. Graham, just recently. But Mr. Scott's right. There's organizations out there that's already doing things like this that I think we need to reach out. Why reinvent the wheel? They have these programs, they have the data, they know which direction, what works, what doesn't work. I think we're just starting off when we can go to these organizations and probably they have a better grasp and kind of take their knowledge and work with them, and vice versa. I think that would be the best way on my personal standpoint on this. Ms. Morgan.
Yeah, as I'm listening, I'm kind of thinking that this has sort of been the silo approach that we've used in the district to solving some problems. This silo is the district can solve this problem on its own in its own curriculum. I think this district has a problem that we have a responsibility to address. I think I agree with Mr. Scott that we need to now take what we have learned from this internal exercise and reach out to the broader community and see what other parties can bring to our understanding of the issue before we decide how it is we want to tackle it internally.
Thank you. Ms. Dozier?
Nothing else to say.
I believe you got your clear direction on this. Consensus, I don't believe on this language. None of us seem to be really convinced on.
So am I hearing no policy on comprehensive health education, but we do continue to address the issue, and I think we do have a partnership of sorts, if I understand, with Healthy Lee. We're involved in that, and we'll continue to be involved in those conversations and see how we can work with that organization.
I think if we drop the policy, that's fine, but as a board member, I would really like to hear a formal presentation at some point during the school year.
On health education? Okay. Other board members agree?
Yes, I'd be more than happy to hear something like that.
This is one of those things that, to me, this would be a great use of this facility we're sitting in right now. If you could bring all of those groups together, like Robbie's involved with Healthy Start. I just came off the board of Healthy Start. There are dozens of them around in the community. And get in one room and figure out what's your role, what's our role, what's their role, and get it figured out and make a community-wide attack on this thing. Because it isn't better, it's worse than it was a few years ago. And we got to put a stop to some of these kinds of things. But doing it ourselves, it's not going to happen effectively enough. So I would encourage you to do that if it's at all possible, to bring some of those groups together. We'll be the catalyst to...
They're well on their way.
Okay.
And they've got some things in place, and I think we were just trying to figure out our role on the wagon. So
You got to this because we heard something
Right.
that alarmed us, and that's why we got to this point. But I think we're ready to say, I think I'm ready to say time out right now.
You jumped the gun.
Yeah.
great, thank you.
Mr. Bill Moore.
Mr. Moore?
Change orders. It's always a pleasure to see you.
Everyone says that to him, so that was very nice.
Lately, he's been coming telling us good news. And he saves us money.
Thank you. Good afternoon, board members, Dr. Graham. Before I talk about change orders, I'd like to preface some of my comments that this summer, Mr. Snell and the construction department has undertaken 43 projects to be taking place this summer, 80% of which will be completed by the time school starts. That's a pretty remarkable feat. And considering all of that amount of work that is taking place, the change order report is very small considering that amount of work. So just to give you some idea to put this in perspective. Start off with, we have change orders by direct material purchases. This past month we had 3, 2 of which were involving in culinary kitchen equipment, where we purchased the equipment directly, and the other was for some lighting materials that went over to the ALC lamp and New Directions. All of that equated to $454,000 that we bought direct, and by doing that we saved $27,000 that went back into the kitty. On the purchase orders themselves, we only had 4 purchase orders that we ended up spending $19,000 total for those. They were minor and all of those were paid for out of the project. We had money still budgeted in the project to take care of those. The contingency is another set of change orders that we have, and that's the contingency adjustment we put into the project, each project, and all of this was funded by out of the contingency. And one thing I'd like to note in here that we get requests all the time from schools to have our buildings rekeyed, and we tell the schools it's kind of an impossibility to just, if you lose a key, to have the building rekeyed. There's one in one of the change orders for we put it as an option to rekey the Tice Elementary School, the old building, in case we didn't have enough money to finish the new building, but we had enough, so we put it back in the project. That's what one of those are for. And the price to rekey Tice is $33,000. Wow. We let the schools know that to rekey a school, an elementary school, it cost average about $35,000, a middle school about $45,000. To rekey a high school, it's about $60,000. So keeping track of keys is extremely important to the schools, and they need to be responsible for their keys. So, any questions?
When are you going to be finished with Tice?
The school itself, the new part, the students will be there when school starts. Now, what we did, when we built the new school, when we tore down the old part, we moved those students into portables. Now those students are moving back into the new schools. Now we're demoing the interior of the old school, so the students that were in the old school, they are now in the portables, and they should be back in there before Christmas. So the project will be completed by Christmas.
Great.
100%.
That's wonderful.
Anybody else? Any questions, comments? Mr. Moore, thank you so much, like always. Well, moving right along, next we have public comment. Mr. Martin?
School Board policy provides the opportunity at this point in the meeting to address the board concerning any matter on this briefing's meeting's agenda. The subject of comment is limited to the items on the briefing meeting agenda, and the time allowed per speaker is 3 minutes.
Do we have anybody on the right? I see one. Do we have anybody on the left?
Well, it's not in reference to today's agenda, but I had to brag on our unit a little bit and our school board and Board of County Commissioners as we start to move forward with our next school year for the 13-14. But I just want to present some awards that we won as a group. Over the summer, our entire unit of 50, including Sheriff Scott, went to Orlando. We were awarded Agency of the Year for Lee County Sheriff's Office. Youth Service Division, which means we're the best at what we do out of 67 counties. And of course, and then nationally, our Exemplary School Safety Award, awarded to us again to Sheriff Scott and the Youth Service Division. On behalf of the School Safety Advocacy Council, we are pleased to present you with this Exemplary School Safety Award. This is a national, international award. Both these are the first ones we've ever won in 34 years. So we're very proud of the men and women, and we appreciate your relationship with us. Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you so much. That's the way to end the meeting. Next, we have Board Attorney and Superintendent's comments. Mr. Martin, do you have any comments?
Yes, sir, Mr. Armstrong, board members, I do have a school law minute, if I may. And the subject I wanted to address today is what Robert's Rules says about the nature of debate for a board. Robert's Rules states that a matter should not be debated until it has been brought before the board in the form of a motion and a second. It also states that in debate, a member may both speak to the motion and offer a secondary motion in the nature of a motion to amend or a motion to table. The remarks made during that discussion should address the merits of the pending question. That is, it should be germane to that question and limited to that subject. Robert's Rule states that members of a board should refrain from attacking another member's motives, and a member can condemn the motion, but must avoid personalities under no circumstances attack or question the motives of another member. The motion, not the member, is the subject of debate. A member may suggest another member is mistaken in a statement that has been made, but should never just suggest that false information is being presented intentionally. Members should be addressed through the chair. That is, a question of another member should be addressed through the chair by stating, Madam Chair, I wish to ask blank the following question. Robert's Rules also says that you should avoid using a member's first name during debate. Additionally, it says that you should refrain from speaking against your own motion. Certainly, it allows for you to vote against a motion that you have made, but you should not speak against it. And if you change your mind during debate, there's always an opportunity to withdraw your motion. Finally, Robert's Rule states that you should refrain from adversely addressing a prior action of the board unless your intention is to conclude by making a motion to rescind, reconsider, or give notice of intent to make such a motion at a future meeting. And finally, one more point. Robert's Rules does address specific rules with respect to a small assembly and states that in boards of members of less than 12 that the chair can take part in the debate, can make or second a motion without leaving the chair. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Dr. Graham.
Nothing at this time, except it's a pleasure to work with you all.
Thank you. Now, next, good of the order. Ms. Dozier.
I have nothing, thank you.
Morgan. Mr. Scott.
Nothing.
I have nothing. At this time, the briefing meeting is concluded. The next meeting will be the budgetary meeting at 5 o'clock.